Oh my God, homie, remember what you told me? I had that 5 propane, never slang cocaine, but I'm on my job all day, just like.
Yeah, what he said. I couldn't figure it out, but I like the beat. So we're back to Gilligan's Island case, United States of America versus Joseph A. Biggs. And it occurred to me this morning as I was brushing my teeth and faire moi toilette that someday I won't be able to talk about this case anymore. But today I do, and today is likely to be a momentous day. Where the government is expected to rest today. That's right, you heard it here first. So around about noon, I suspect the government to conclude its case, and then we will adjourn for the weekend. The defense case will begin next Monday. But yesterday, what a day! I have this paranoid fantasy that the court directs the House staff, to kind of turn the heat up to try to wear us down because it was sweltering in the courtroom. And all day long, there was this funk in the air. The judge was riding me in my direct exam or cross examination of a witness, kept objecting to my use of Tom Paine to impeach a government FBI agent. History. We're not here for history. We're here. Stick to the evidence. And I'm like, Judge, we are our history. But, I digress. And then in the afternoon, things got even more heated between a couple lawyers. And as I'm packing my briefcase, you hear that sound that sounds like fists are ready to fly. And I look up, and across the courtroom, there's this tense knot of people. And two lawyers are screaming at one another. And there's hatred in their faces and vitriol in their eyes.
And
it was my 72-year-old female colleague, Carmen Hernandez, getting into it with a much younger lawyer male from the Department of Justice. And so I walked over thinking, well, blessed are the peacemakers. Nah. I walked over thinking, I want to be here when the first she's going to knock him into the twilight zone, but it didn't happen. Calmer heads prevailed, and I'm sure the spirit of professionalism will prevail this morning when we walk into court. Lots of disputes to come next week when the defense case comes on. The government is still fighting us with respect to our ability to learn who the confidential human sources embedded in the Proud Boys on January 6th actually were. Maybe we'll find out, maybe we won't. But it does leave, in my mind, some significant questions about whether we are in a COINTELPRO 2 era. Hold on while I plug my computer in to make sure it doesn't lose charge in the middle of our broadcast there. What am I talking about, COINTELPRO? Those of you of a certain age will remember the Church Committee's reports on FBI infiltration of the left in the 60s and 70s. And federal agents were ordered by Herbert Hoover to get to the bottom of those radicals tearing the country apart. And so federal agents would infiltrate groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They got close to Martin Luther King, and they'd spread defamatory letters about one another, these groups to one another, seeking to sow dissension. The Church Committee was outraged by this and placed severe limits or strict limits on domestic surveillance of dissent in the United States. In that case, the dissent was on the left. I think the dissent is more likely to be on the right now, and there is a suspicion, at least I have a suspicion, that the federal government is using nefarious means that it used against the left in the 60s and 70s against the right now, here in the early eras of the 21st century. And if it was wrong then, it's wrong now. And so we mean to try to blow the lid off of this if we're permitted to do so. But every indication suggests that we're going to be in a fight and that the FBI is going to fight us on preventing this jury from knowing its sources and means of how it surveils the American people. And let me tell you something, that makes my blood boil. I mean, if we revolted against the British colony because of a tax on tea, I mean, there was no federal income tax then, and we were upset about a tax on papers in the forms of the Townsend Acts, and we didn't want to have general warrants where the king's men could search our homes or our persons or our effects at will looking for evidence of a crime. If that was enough to provoke revolution in 1776, when did we become a nation of sheep that decided in the name of safety we'd permit the FBI to monitor who attends school boards and label parents terrorists for expressing dissent? So
I think somewhere around the year 1913. We'll see. We'll see.
Maybe that's the way it's always been.
Well, for those larger audiences, those daily shows, the Tim Pools, the etc. This is the proposition that they should be espousing on their platforms, not the headlines of the FBI destroying evidence with no follow through, no follow up, nothing there. Right? They've conflated the issue of QAnon shaman with whatever the spill issue was that was dealt with promptly by the court last week, right, and earlier this week. But what you just said, Norm, should be the clear focus, right?
Well, it will be mine going forward. This case has, unfortunately, I hate to use the term because it's so commonly used, but this case has radicalized me. What I have seen in the courtroom has been sufficiently disturbing. Proud Boys are not domestic terrorists. They're not even racists. They're people who placed a value on the West and regard themselves as Western chauvinists. Their motto is they refuse to apologize for creation of the modern world, as I don't think anyone should. And the extent to which the FBI and others have sought to criminalize dissent, this case, dissent coming from the right, tells me that we've come full cycle in American politics. People sometimes say, well, we'll get into this woke thing in a minute, but I think the problem of government and government surveillance and government manipulation of people has been a constant, and fear of government is one of the defining characteristics of Americanism, in my view. And
that's powerful stuff, Norm. But you're right.
In fact, yes. So I was down in the lunch line yesterday. This tells you a little bit about tensions in the courtroom in general. And I had referred to the Proud Boys as misplaced patriotism as being the inspiration for their rioting at the Capitol that day. And some lefty guy, he looks like more of a hippie than I do, and I've got a freak flag here, as you see. He started mocking me, and I said, "Look, do you feel safe enough yet? Do you feel safe enough? Because I'll do anything for your safety, dear." And, things got kind of tense in the lunch line in the cafeteria. Eric Dickinson, you want your MATA shirt? We've got to work on our merch angle. You want to make America think again? Here's the thing you want America to think about today. Is the FBI engaged in domestic surveillance of dissent? And the answer is almost certainly yes. And if an FBI agent seeks to resist a subpoena or court order to testify because he doesn't want the American people to know the manner and means by which they are surveilled, that is an outrage. And that is an outrage that needs to be met with two fists and resolution. But
thumbs up in the chat. Eric Dickinson says, "I want my MATA shirt." MATA, of course, being Make America Think Again. So if that's something that we should be offering up to you all, please let us know. The chat's active this morning. Good morning to Bathtub Liquor, Pete Atkinson, Lawyer Will, hello. Sparkly Reese, Thinking Man, nice to see you as well. Pete Atkinson, you tweeted something, I think, earlier this week where you said you had the best day of your professional career ever. So I don't know what that was about, but congratulations to you. And I have a separate question. I'll shoot it to you offline. It may have something to do with the Pope and a vow of celibacy, but I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can cover that some next week on the stream, Norm.
Damn, no kidding. Pete, vow of celibacy, the Pope, best day of his professional life ever. My mind whirls with possibilities. So what we promised you today was a discussion of wokeism. What is woke? And I almost got into it a moment ago, but and the topic came alive because someone was ridiculed online for not being able to come up with an offhand definition of it, notwithstanding being opposed to it.
Before you go on, Lawyer Will asked an important question.
He has a way of doing that.
But he says something. He asked a good question. What limits were placed on the FBI by the Church Committee?
Well, I think that there were limits on what domestic surveillance, what intelligence officials could do with respect to American citizens. So, for example, the CIA is prohibited, in theory, from engaging in domestic surveillance. I think the FBI, I don't recall off the top of my head, I'll be honest with you, Lawyer Will, I'll be looking at it over the weekend, what substantive limits were placed on the FBI's domestic surveillance activities. But the Church Committee was outraged to learn, for example, that the FBI had infiltrated circles close to Martin Luther King, and had sought to and had frankly engaged in monitoring of his sex life. Apparently, Fidelity and Mr. King were not close friends, and he was a philanderer. That doesn't, and so that information was spread within the civil rights community to try to undermine his credibility, because J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI thought that the civil rights movement was a threat to the American Republic. In the same way, I would suggest that people now think that groups like the Proud Boys, or people who seek to place America first, or MAGA Republicans, are a threat to the Republic. What they are, in fact, is a threat to a prevailing ideology. And when law enforcement embraces the view of an ideologue, or takes an ideological point of view, and the state weaponizes its resources against a particular point of view, one could argue that that's a misapplication of the state's power. And that's what infused the Church Committee's report. And it did so to the benefit of what we would now regard as the left. I think a similar effort is going on the right, and Jim Jordan's oversight committee on the weaponization of government. I don't know if Jim Jordan has the gravitas of a Frank Church. I don't know if the committee will squander its moment by tap dancing with the QAnon shaman on Tucker Carlson. But there's a much broader issue. And that broader issue is, how do we come together as a people with a common conception of right? And what is the role of government in monitoring our ongoing struggle? And so, to the extent that government has been pressed to the service of one ideological faction in American life at the expense of another, that is a deeply divisive move. And so, Lawyer Will, I'm ducking the question. I don't know about substantive limits in the law, but I know that what infused the discussion was the need to keep government surveillance agents out of our political associations.
That's right. Well, and thinking man, Norm, just to give you some quick flowers on a Good Friday morning, St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, yeah, it is. Woo! Hey, that suggests to me a way to spend the afternoon. I am, after all, around the corner from Kelly's Irish Pub here in Washington, D.C., but I digress, which is next door to the Dubliners. And I can tell you, having eaten at both establishments from time to time in the last 3 months, every day is St. Patrick's Day there.
Well, Thinking Man says something that I wholeheartedly agree with. Norm should replace Mark Levin on Fox as the great one. I no longer watch Fox. Yeah, I agree. I think, Norm, you said before that, you had more of a Howard Stern approach to this. You'd rather replace Howard Stern, but perhaps Mark Levin is the one that you should replace. These are all, Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, these are all people that I used to listen to almost daily, that I have long since moved away from. It's been at least 2 years since I've listened to any of their daily stuff. So Thinking Man, I agree with you.
Well, I mean, but I'm not looking to jump into that buzzsaw. Here's the dark truth of opinion, of being an opinion maker or opinion maker for a living. I worked as an editorial writer at the Hartford Courant many years ago. I mean, how old am I? This was in the early 1980s, and I was one of 5 or 4 editorial writers for the oldest continuously published paper in the United States. And I had what many would regard as a fantasy job. My job was to come in the morning, 8:30, 9 o'clock, read 3 or 4 newspapers. They'd let me pick them: the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a couple local papers. This was before the age of the internet. And then attend an editorial board meeting at around 11, where 15 or 16 of us would sit together and we'd talk about what we read in the morning. There were editors and the publisher of the paper. And then I would be given an assignment to write an editorial in the afternoon, usually an essay of some 300 to 800 words long, crystallizing the opinion of the paper. It was a blast. But it was also a lot of pressure, because some days I'd sit there and, I'd think, oh, God, I got to come up with something. And I'd go to the meeting and nothing really mattered. I didn't care. Hey, the world
Hi,
looks
my name's
pretty
Norm
good.
Pattis. Today is Friday, March 17th, and nothing really matters.
And so the maybe this is an more important point than we started out to realize. This was back in the day where all we had to do, the group of us on the editorial page, was select some opinion columns for the page opposite the editorial page, the so-called op-ed page, edit those for style, fact check them, edit whatever letters to the editor came in, and then fill couple columns with editorials. Maybe it was 2,500 words for the day for the group of us. I really don't know. And that was a lot of work. And it was a lot of controversy and a lot of travail. And even there, we ran out of things to say. And sometimes we do pieces which in the trade were called thumb suckers, think pieces. This is what you should think about that. That's what we all did all day long. 5 days a week, 365 weekdays, or 52 weeks of the year. There weren't 365 weeks back then. Now think of the 24/7 news cycle and the imperative always to have something to say. And I think one of the things that's gone wrong with that cycle in the cable news industry and blogging and, even the podcasting in general is the need to outrage and engage each time.
Yeah, I think particularly with respect to podcasting, right? Yeah, I think that's a particular problem with respect to the audio, video, podcast, stream stuff. I was thinking about a little bit about this the other day, maybe a couple of days ago, before we got on. What is our mandate here? Really thinking through the fact that a lot of what we talk about is downstream, right? And what really brought you and I together, Norm, was this shared notion of legitimacy and the lack thereof in modern society. So I think you and I are both committed to figuring out what those things are that we can do to increase optimism, to at least sprinkle optimism and what I think the young people call white pill these days, right? And so, I think that one thing that I am in particular interested in is even in and among the despair and it's easy to despair these days with so much going on and with so much confusion and frenetic energy, finding a way for you and I to at least communicate to people that there isn't really a need to despair. Most of what's going on, you can take control in your own personal life.
I think that's right. And the fact is that most of us, all of us, continue to live daily lives wherein we attend to the ordinary needs of daily living, eating, keeping the lights on, the roof over our heads, and caring for our family members. And this will go on despite the ideologues. And in a better society, in a better world, there'd be important ideas about how best to do that. And those are the ideas of excellence that infuse a culture. And I'll be so bold as to say infused Western civilization. This is why people read the classics, because they wanted to learn how to live a good life. And we've given up on that in the name of a woke life. And so let's transition into wokeness. I haven't had a chance to read the essay this morning. Yesterday I said to Mike, let's talk about what it means to be woke, because there seems to be a discussion about that. And then I forgot what we were going to talk about. Woke up this morning and said to Mike, what are we doing? And he said, oh my God. So, what am I going to say? So I started to look at things online. There's an interesting essay this morning. I can't remember. I think it's in the New York Times. Pamela Paul, I pledge allegiance to ellipse my conscience. And I think that headline summarizes what wokeism is. Wokeism is a glorification of yourself, and a demand for recognition of that self in the moment. And so to be woke is to be perpetually alive and enthralled by yourself, and to demand that others regard yourself as preciously as you regard yourself. And it is a social cancer. And I am anti-woke. If you look in the dictionary, Merriam-Webster's or whatnot, woke will say, it's a colloquial, it's a term that arose largely in African-American culture, meaning to be alive to and aware of racial discrimination in the United States. And there is a long history of it. And it's a history with which we need to grapple. I understand that. But wokeism, being aware of your surroundings, being aware of what makes the world around you what it is one thing. But being woke, meaning being alive and awake to yourself and demanding that everybody else regard you as precious, is what brings us, drag queen story hours for 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds, and passionate national debate about whether this is a good or a bad thing. Being woke is what brings you to your human resources office saying you need recognition for your new pronoun, because you've decided that whatever nature made you isn't good enough for you. So you'd rather remake nature and demand recognition of this new precious one of 72 genders selves you found yourself. So wokeism, in my view, is an exhaustion device. It is a means of diminishing, demeaning, and ridiculing human possibility by saying that all things are equal. It represents the bottom having fallen out of pluralism. We no longer contend for in the marketplace of ideas with differing views of excellence. We contend now with different demands for recognition. And wokeism is the demand for recognition of every life form, however expressed, and it's always going to end up at ridiculous extremes. And so, it's not a quick one-line thing, but I guess, I see Justin says Norm is one witty dude. Let me aspire to wittiness there and say, wokeism is wokeism is a sense of self taken too seriously. Because if the idea of sin teaches anything, it is that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that we are precious again in the eyes of God and therefore ought to be regarded as precious ourselves. But we're not precious because of who we are. We're precious because of how we have been made, because of of our relationship to our Creator. And recognition of the self means recognition of sin, means recognition of the need for grace, of the need for redemption. And so every self, all God loved all, what does it say in John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. All are equal in God's eyes, but that doesn't mean we are all equal to one another in our own eyes, regardless of what we do, because that would say of the pots, saying to the potter, I want to be remade. Why makest me thus? I demand recognition this week in my new leather pants with my pink hair and a paper clip hanging out of my ear and my nose ring. Next week, when I come in with a buzz cut, I'm going to be just as precious. And you're going to have to demand me then. The self's demand for recognition is the sin of pride. And we will know no rest until we find our rest in thee, as Augustine wrote on the first page of the Confessions.
Well, the chat is alive with their own definitions of woke, and I love how there's a recursive relationship with these messages back and forth. You're building on each other's ideas. I'd just like to stop and say that this is a rhetorical game. We're only talking about this because someone in a position of hosting a widely publicized and watched show put another journalist and writer on the spot, and then use that as a way to distract from having to, in fact, answer to any of the symptoms, any of the issues, the downstream ill effects that you were just talking about, Norm.
Well, and let's do a microcosmic analysis.
Before you do that, let me just finish this by saying the only thing I would add to you, to your definition of woke, which, as I understand it, is ultimately extreme narcissism, right? View of self, very materialistic. To complete that definition, I would say, and also unwilling to be accountable for the excesses thereof. Wokeness is a combination of extreme narcissism and a desire to cloak or camouflage from accountability for that extreme narcissism. And there is an entire system that is in place that wants you to believe that all of that is diffuse, that everything that we're seeing, DEI, critical race theory, critical social justice, any of these initiatives are somehow fragmented and not related to one another. So when we talk about that, just say someone who is woke is also someone who doesn't know how to define what a democracy is, but uses it superfluously today, right? So don't get caught up in the game. And I'll go back to some of these chats, but go ahead.
Woke is the adult saying, Mommy, I want a popsicle.
Yes. So here, I'll go to the chat. So Sparkly Reese says, don't fall into the trap of being forced or expected to define woke. I semi-agree with that, Sparkly, but I also think that you should go on offense, right? The issue here, again, is the cloak or the camouflage or that veneer that asking that direct question is designed to prompt, right? To put the pressure on you to define something that ultimately has its power in a collective sense of identity, not in any one person being accountable for the excesses of their own narcissism and ignorance, right? Thinking Man says woke is directly tied to income equality. Pete Atkinson says woke equals judging based on outcomes rather than merit, and that applies to racial areas, education, finances. Lawyer Will says woke means identity is sacred and valued more than accomplishments.
There you go.
And T Girl
I think
says
Lawyer Will beat Pete Atkinson today. Sorry, Pete. Although I think
Lawyer Will. Except Pete Atkinson gets he gets to be in the chat because he's
Pete Atkinson. No, Pete Atkinson is the king of the hill in that family. We'll have dinner one night next week and we'll discuss why your climb of the mountain is good. So let's get together again and have dinner at that nice Italian joint before I leave Washington. As I'm expected to before Easter. Hey, let's pivot real quick. An example of how wokeism can be transformed from something important, because I think a concern with social inequality is important, into something absurd, is San Francisco and San Francisco's tap dancing with reparations. So there's a proposal in San Francisco for a reparations for African Americans. And we see here on the head, the tagline, San Francisco Board of Supervisors, its governing body, unanimously supports $5 million for individual reparation payments. This would come out of municipal funds. But not just that, like a $97,000 a year guaranteed payment for 250 years to any Black person and or his or her descendants, plus forgiveness of taxes for life or I don't remember how long, and the ability to purchase a home for $1. Sounds good to me. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. I mean, if you want to live in a world wherein you are not accountable to anyone and in effect be a perpetual dependent on the public teat, which is just another form of slavery as far as I'm concerned, another form of dependence, then move to San Francisco and claim your entitlement to reparations. But here's a question that the San Francisco Board of Supervisors need to ask and perhaps answer seriously. Who the hell do you think is going to want to live in that city other than people who are looking for universal payouts? And once you've destroyed your tax base and driven out the people who are supposed to pay for this, who's going to pay for fantasy land? Reparations, their history is tragedy. And we are all broken on the wheel of time. And our ideals are all made a mockery of in the practices that we keep. And it's easy. We are all hypocrites, each and every one of us. That's what sin means. That's why the idea of original sin is so powerful. If you are going to erect an idol to righteousness and demand to be the beneficiary of righteousness, that's just another form of pride. So while there may be, and there are in fact, serious issues of racial injustice in the United States, reparations is just not the solution. It's certainly in the form of race-based transfer payments. The most powerful argument I have seen for reparations is, to the degree that people's life chances are defined by their socioeconomic status and or their race, the way to remedy that and cure that going forward to make a good society is through education. And so, and I believe that since the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson's time, we have made strides toward educational opportunity for all. I, for one, am the beneficiary of one, even though I'm not a Black person. My family was impecunious and poor. I survived the ravages of alcoholism in the form of my parents, and left my home when I was 16, and was the recipient of wonderful fellowships and scholarships from many educational institutions that made it possible for me to become the spectacular failure I am today. That's a nod to the haters out there. But education can transform a life. Good literature can transform a life. And that's why we offer it. And so I'm all in favor of providing education so that the next generation of Americans has the ability to flourish as best as they can. But in terms of handouts, making San Francisco into sort of a neo-woke plantation where yesterday's slaves become tomorrow's perpetual dependents on a massa they can't see, because who's going to live in San Francisco and pay for all that? That's just ridiculous. So maybe the San Francisco Board of Supervisors has done us a favor by making a burlesque of this concept and showing it to be as ridiculous as it is.
Well, you and I have talked about the concept of reparations for quite a long time. Anybody who's been around since Norm's radio days know that this was a thing that came up almost weekly. And we actually covered the draft reparations plan that San Francisco published back in December. and we detailed, the $5 million individual payments was just one of many. And Norm, you referenced that a couple of minutes ago, but we're talking about, banking, we're talking about tax credits, we're talking about property, we're talking about trusts set up for successive payments down the road. It really does appear as a fairy tale, and the critics of this plan have pointed out there's no data, there's no formula, there's nothing that is driving the metrics on this. They're sort of being conjured out of a sense of maybe this is enough, and why not ask for this and why not ask for that. And I think I said this at the beginning that there is no legal pathway through which reparations can survive scrutiny at present. And I think that this is ultimately just sort of an aggressive negotiation on the part of the NAACP. And
it's not an aggressive note. Let me steal a page from Scott Adams' playbook. If this is what you want, I'm just not interested. And so, San Francisco, farewell. If this is San Francisco's idea of racial justice, then white America is going to say, okay, you pay for it. Here's a printing press. Here's some paper. Print out all the dollar bills you want. Print out all the Wakanda bills you want and knock yourself out. But I'm not standing behind them, and I'm just not.
Well, ultimately, I think that this is something that makes me think that money isn't even real anymore. This is on the this isn't happening just as the SVB and Signature Bank meltdown. This has been happening ahead of that. But it is really interesting that the government has flooded the market with money. Banks are now failing. And then we're talking about issuing, $5 million to each individual in a city that has already run amok. You ask any average person who's been to San Francisco in the last 5-6 years, what the state of that place is. I'm one of those people that you can ask anecdotally what the situation in San Francisco is, and it's abhorrent. It's terrible. Life on the streets there is nuts. There's no governance. There's no legitimate governing structure that is organized trying to make the lives of people there better. This is a bunch of puffery. And I'm not even sure that this is even real money that we're talking about anymore. That's a much larger question, but
that larger question we'll talk about next week. And maybe we can find somebody to talk about it on long form. This idea of a digital currency, it has appeals, but it's also frightening, because if we move away from a cash society and we place our ability to transact in the marketplace in the hands of a third party, we give to a third party the ability to control how we interact with one another economically, because they can turn our CBD, our cash off, our digital currency off. But
so before we get off here, T-Girl says, how is the view from the top of the mountain, Will? And Lawyer Will says, it's lonely at the top.
Invite us on up. Send a ski lift down to we proletarians here at Law and Legitimacy, Lawyer Will.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Man, this flew by. We didn't get to the other two items. We were going to talk about the Justice Department, the Department of Justice telling the court that, there's 1,000 more J6 defendants.
Don't get me started.
And then we were also going to talk about the Mexican drug cartels and the group of Americans that went, across the border to get cosmetic surgery and ended up being kidnapped, and a couple of them were killed. And then there's also a corresponding pushback from Mexican diplomats that are threatening to support the Democrat Party if the rhetoric that America is using about the cartelization of Mexico and their inability to control that stuff doesn't get tamped down. So
if you tell too much truth, we'll hurt you. Okay.
Exactly.
I'm ready for the pain. I'm ready for the pain, Pedro. Bring it on.
Oh, my goodness. Anyway, well, we'll be back next week on Monday, 7:45 a.m. And Norm will be fit to be tied, because he'll be getting ready to launch the defense's case in the United States v. Joseph Biggs case there in D.C. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Twitter, wherever. Please put a thumbs up on this video and please share it. And I'll get into a habit of trying to list what we're doing for the forthcoming, for the next day, the night before, so that we can get as many people in here chatting as possible. But I cannot overstate how pleased Norm and I are to have so many of you in here talking with one another and talking with us. It means a lot.
It sure do. See you next week, everybody. Stay safe. Read a good book. Save the Republic. Do something funny. Go into a coffee shop and quote Cicero. Yeah, get it done.
See you next week, Norm.
See you next week.